fellow alchemists, and welcome to Wordplay Wizardry. So as you probably guessed from the title, we're going to continue our foray into the world of poetry. We've already discussed the basics and general structure, which means it's time to go over the different styles. Now, Wikipedia lists 139 different styles and types of poetry, and that is far too many to cover here. So let's go over a handful, the most popular, the most common, and the styles that the vast majority of poets adopt. And right off the bat, let's go over a few that are simpler. Already, we've touched on haikus, which, if you remember, are 3 lines with 5 syllables, then 7, and then 5 again. But there's 3 others that, if you're looking to become a poet, may not be the backbone of your work. Ode, limerick, and elegy. Of the 3, it would be the most understandable for a poet or new poet to include a number of odes. And an ode is a poem in celebration of someone or something. A limerick is a 5-line poem with a specific rhyming pattern. The first 2 lines rhyme, the second 2 lines rhyme, and the last line rhymes with the first 2. Limericks are almost always humorous or bawdy. Bawdy, if you didn't know, means dirty, sexual in nature. And finally, an elegy is a mournful poem. Generally, there are few rules for an elegy outside the topic of death or loss. Now, the forms that you will most likely favor are acrostic, ballad, sonnet, the epic, narrative poetry, villanelle, free verse poems, blank verse, concrete poems, blackout poems. There is one more that I want to mention, and that is ghazal. This is an older Arabic form of poetry and most often deals with love or spirituality. The problem with ghazals, especially the originals, is that they don't translate well into English. The rhyming and meters change, which means they don't hold to their original form. Now, you can write new ghazals and do so in English or the language of your choosing, but they do have strict rules. Ghazals contain 5 or more couplets, but no more than 15. Additionally, every line must end with a word that rhymes with the last word of the first line or the word itself. The rhyming format would look like this. Now, this way of describing lines using letters to show linking rhyming pairs is very common in poetry. The idea is that everything that shares a letter also shares a rhyme. By illustrating them in this way, we can better understand and visualize the connections between lines. Though, because there's so much to cover, I will more than likely do individual videos on each particular poetry type. In the meantime, let's continue. In an acrostic poem, the first letter of each line, when read vertically, spells out something. This something is related to the poem in some fashion. Perhaps it is the subject of the poem. The ballad is a narrative poem with a melody-like rhyming scheme. And yes, a ballad must rhyme. A common scheme would be this. For those keeping score, this is what is known as a quatrain, a group of 4 lines or stanzas. Next up is the sonnet. Made famous by Shakespeare, the sonnet has 2 forms, Shakespearean and Petrarchan, and there's rules for the rhyming in each. However, the base rules for a sonnet are that they rhyme, are often but not always about love, and contain 14 lines. Both forms of sonnet adhere to the line length. Next up, the epic is long-form poetry. These are essentially short stories, but in a poetic format. They don't have to rhyme, but a metered style is always preferred. Beyond that, they are grand. Epic, as the name suggests, Now, we touched on narrative with ballad, but the type stands as its own because a straight narrative poem has its own rules outside of those of the ballad. But generally, a narrative poem is one that tells a tale. Think of it like a lyrical short story, but even shorter than the epic. Edgar Allan Poe is famous for narrative poetry. They can rhyme, but they always have a metered style. Now, the villanelle is a poetry type that more than likely demands its own separate video. The rules for this French poetry style are extensive, but overall, villanelles have 19 lines. They have 5 groups of 3 connected lines, with the last group being 4 connected lines, which looks like this. Next up is free verse, and free verse is the most open style because it literally has no rules. Blank verse, however, is different. In this form, there is a metered style, but it doesn't have to rhyme. So if you write a poem and it doesn't really fit into any one category, odds are it would fit with blank verse, so long as it has a meter pattern. If you plan on getting your feet wet in the poetry world, blank verse is a great place to start. Now, concrete poems are a little different. Instead of having a specific scheme, they have a specific look. And yes, I mean that literally. The design of the lines, the length, and the placement are done in a way that they look like an object, particularly one that is involved with the subject of the poem. For example, if you wanted to write about the holiday season, then the concrete poem would look like a Christmas tree or perhaps a star. These poems are less about meter and rhyming and more about the outward appearance. Another visual poem is the blackout poem. In this form, the poem is created by taking an existing piece of work, say a piece of prose, and covering up the vast majority of words. What is left behind has new meaning and is a new entity altogether. When read in order, usually left to right, top to bottom, per Western style, this is how you would read the new poem. Some poets will take famous or public domain pieces and use them for the basis of their blackout poetry. However, a fun thing to do would be create your own. Write a prose piece, probably flash fiction length, and then use that to create your blackout poem. Since you know the words, you can assign new meaning to the piece. Perhaps the prose excerpt is about hate or war. The blackout poem is about peace or love. Then you can put them side by side and let people see the duality. Now that you have an idea about the styles and forms, you can start to pick and choose. Try a few out. See what fits best with your sensibilities. And since these videos take a little longer to create and post than does a quick internet search, I would also suggest you do a little reading as well. Take one of the forms that stands out to you and learn a little more. Maybe even take one out for a test drive. Write a poem in that style. And who knows? Maybe by the time I post a video on that specific style, you can tell me more about it. But thank you so much for tuning in. And until next time, fellow alchemists, take care.